the more influence that business has on the economy, the less influence that the individuals have on the economy. And it makes you feel powerless.
Today, we want to take a dive into looking at how current politics and world leadership changes could affect the economy in the next year, the shifts that have led us to our current state, and some of the other factors at play. So, I'd like to kick this off handing to Brian. Brian, would you mind starting out just kind of telling us how we're going to define economics today?
Yeah, sure. So, and again, I just want to highlight the idea that this is all opinion based, right? I mean, multiple people can look at an economic situation and come away with it believing entirely different things, and they're not necessarily right or wrong as long as we're playing in the same pool of facts, right? And I want to make sure that we try to stick to with this. So the question ultimately is, do you mind rephrasing that question real quick for me? It's essentially how are we kind of defining the economics of today based on the changes that are happening within the world economy? Is that kind of fair to say?
I mean, that's a much deeper question. I was just wondering if you could kind of like frame, how we should look at economics. So the other day, you and I were sort of talking about it being how economics affects everything that you buy and you're able to provide for your family and your life.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, you kind of said it well yourself, right? I mean, the idea of economics is how does monetary policy, the laws and regulations that are created by governments here in the United States and around the world, just how do nations interact with each other? How does that kind of impact your bottom line and how you're able to feed your family, clothe your family, enjoy life in any way possible, right? It all kind of plays into that. So, yeah, the topic is extremely broad and we can take this in a lot of different ways. So, talking about the changes that have happened politically over the past month here in the United States and the trends that have kind of come out of this worldwide over the past few years, certainly since the pandemic, we're in for an interesting ride over the next few years. And I'm excited to discuss that with you guys.
Thank you. That maybe is a good starting place a few years ago. But how did the circumstances of the pandemic shape the economy differently than what we've seen in years prior or maybe ever in history? And should we expect those changes to be permanent? So, Brian, feel free to go ahead and answer the question first, and then we'll kind of have a group discussion around that if that's okay.
I'll be honest, I'm going to kind of keep this US centric just because it's what I know best on this. And I certainly feel free to give me any variants that you guys have seen around the world. So, when the pandemic happened, the US response was mixed between Trump kind of doing some wild things and some wild ideas about certain things. One of the big things that kind of came out of it was everyone kind of got money. It wasn't significant money, but for people that were laid off, for example, they were getting money from the states to not have to work. Federally, they gave us certain amounts of cash at the time. So you had this weird little thing where people were being paid not to work and stay home in some cases, except for the people that had to go to work. That created a weird power dynamic between the haves and have-nots that still exists today and probably kind of fueled some of the political things that we're seeing now. Some of the move back to the right in the case of the US, some of the move to the right in other parts of the world. It's just as things kind of grew, Biden and our country kind of took the blame or the credit for the outcome of the pandemic here in the US. And that's been kind of his cross to bear, for better or for worse. Aside from the money, if you're looking at this from kind of a business perspective, businesses kind of had to pivot. You are in a situation where the way you've made money forever is oftentimes not viable anymore. So either you find a way to adapt, whether it's because people processes couldn't be what they are, or just the economy won't allow them to work due to rules, regulations, restrictions, things of that nature. So you either pivoted and changed the way you did business or you failed. One of the things that kind of is coming out of this, and we had a previous conversation about this, and I think it's going to be huge as we go forward, is how did the pandemic affect AI, the growth of AI, and then the ultimate way that is going to change the job market in the future. Had the pandemic not happened, would the AI movement have materialized quite so quickly? Now, there's other reasons why it might have, and I'm not here to say that it definitively did or did not, but there's no doubt that it had an influence on it. So there's a lot of different pieces to this, and I'm more than happy to hear anyone else's kind of questions or thoughts on anything that I just said, because that was a lot.
I think one of the things that I find interesting about COVID, the pandemic, but pandemics conceptually in general, or at least any sort of exponential growth curve in regards to like infectious diseases, having that sort of thing, is your reaction, good or bad, it always seems to feel bad. Like if you react early enough, there's very little impact, then it feels like you overreacted because it didn't get that bad. And if you react only a little bit later, it feels like it got way worse than you should have let it happen because of those exponential curves. And I think that's a interesting factor on a lot of the discussions around COVID. But another thing that I think has been a big change, and I think probably interacts with that AI change in some ways, is the work from home movement. Before COVID, I was working from the office 5 days a week without exception, and that just seemed normal to me. And now it seems insane now that I'm working back at 5 days in the office. So do you think there's been a big impact from that sort of work from home change? And do you think that's interacted with economically the AI response, in that people sort of have more flexibility in how they approach their work?
Yes, thank you for bringing up the idea of the work from home thing, because it is another reason. If you're thinking about the politics and kind of the change that, again, in the US, the election, it is kind of dividing people from those that are white collar jobs who have the luxury of even being able to do something like this. And then the blue collar workers, where it's just not an option. If you're a plumber, you can't remotely fix someone's toilet, at least not yet. As an engineer, maybe that's something to work on. But it's such a fascinating thing, because I think from my perspective, I was work from home prior to the pandemic. It was something I fought for. It's something that has served me well for a very long time. I'd like to think that it serves my company well, because they get what I think is probably the best version of me. And that might be scary to some, but work from home had a very profound impact on cities in particular, right? The larger cities got hit even harder than the smaller ones, because you're basically taking thousands of workers who small businesses would expect for lunches, coffee shops, gyms, things like that. They had this built-in clientele, and then all of a sudden it's just gone. And so to go from that to where we landed during the pandemic, and kind of as we've come out of it, it's made it far less appealing to live in these giant metropolitan areas. And the cities, municipalities, areas are hurting because of it. And cities care about this because they've been giving all sorts of tax breaks to these companies to come to their places, right? And the idea, again, spur the local economy, get people working there, get people eating there, playing there, going to shows there, and all those sorts of things. If there isn't the kind of, not mandate up until recently, but the natural mandate of the expectation that you're going to be there 5 days a week, it just kind of completely changes how local economies make money. You either thrive in change or you get buried by change, the thing that people are coping with. And so the natural reactions often to just kind of revert to the mean, try to go back to the way it was. And as you kind of experience yourself, right? You weren't work from home beforehand, but I'm sure you kind of enjoyed not having to commute to work, the chaos that comes from
Just the time back.
yeah, even working from an office and all of your teammates are in another location. So what's the freaking point, right? For my example, the team that I work with most is all based in India. What difference does it make if I'm in an office, given the fact that I'm never going to see these people in person? It creates complication.
That's an interesting point, Brian. For some companies, you can talk about yours specifically, or you could talk about them in general. Do you feel like there's been more of a trend to hire international teams because maybe we're more comfortable with having some of those Zoom conference calls be part of our life now, like our work life? Or does that not change?
Yeah, I don't know if it's really changed. I think there's an economics question to be had there. Why am I in charge of a team that's entirely based in India, and all the complications that come with that? Just time zone differences, the ability to kind of work in shifts almost. To me, that would have been a thing 10, 15 years ago, just because it's cheaper. It's easier to hire two or three engineers in India versus one here in the US. You can get more work done. The quality of work is generally as good. So it's just global competition at that point. The thing that you should be looking out for in the future is AI replacing those overseas workers, right? That'll be the next iteration of this over time.
Interesting. I was actually thinking in your case, it's kind of neat that you almost have like a changing of the guard in your team. When you start your workday, they're ending theirs. When they're ending theirs, you're starting. So you guys have meetings and kind of pass things over. That seems like it works out amazingly for an employer from an economic sense, too.
Well, there's challenges to that, right? Not to uncover it too much, but I am technically savvy, but I am not a technical expert in the way that these guys are, right? I can program, I'm comfortable programming. These guys live and breathe it. So the second that they sign off for the night, which they're absolutely entitled to do, I am probably the biggest pro worker advocate that you're ever going to see at a corporate level. There is a drop off in productivity because I can't do the work that any one of them can do. And I certainly can't do the work that all of them can do. So there's value, right? Because I get the thing that I'm able to do is talk with the different business users, troubleshoot things, start dreaming up new ideas, putting things into practice. But the actual work that gets done, shit, man, it's not me. I'm not going to take credit for that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point how your particular team is structured. And then coming back to Spencer's question and how the pandemic sort of like shaped us being in the office. For my industry, it resulted in me not being in the office at all. A lot of in person industries, it was a lot of layoffs in the beginning, and then a lot of people kind of jumping ship. I think a lot of people have changed careers, or if they can, again, I can't remotely make a latte. I think there's a big need still for that inhuman experience, but yeah, for me personally, it resulted in me working remotely and training and coaching remotely. Coming back to economics, there are a lot of startup businesses, I think, that sort of came out of the pandemic. And I think there are more people still kind of thinking about maybe how the pandemic shook things up for them. Brian, I guess to you first, how do you think less established businesses and startups might want to think about economics in the coming years, say from a business that has an established history or a larger business, perhaps?
Sure. Honestly, the first benefit that they have is that they have the knowledge of knowing what happens when kind of the ultimate pivot comes along, right? A global pandemic like this is not something that happens every day, right? It certainly hasn't happened in most lifetimes of anyone that's been on this planet right now. Having that knowledge, you can think about how you design your business to, one, either designed around the idea that things can change in an instant, or at least have the knowledge and the experience of going through it to be able to more quickly adapt to it, right? In the case of you, Nancy, and gyms, now that these gyms have gone through this, they can either go to more online classes quickly, and they probably have some of the infrastructure to get that done now within days instead of weeks, if not months. They also have the ability to change the way that they use the infrastructure that they actually have, right? With that experience comes the ability to kind of pivot, and you're not going to just sell off your gyms, right? If you're a Planet Fitness, for example, and you have thousands of locations throughout the country, you're not going to get rid of them. But you might be able to find ways to utilize them on a smaller scale while then pivoting to online so that everyone that is a client of yours can get some value from what they're buying. And that goes for any business, right? For larger businesses, it gives you the ability to pivot. But again, if you're going back to small startups, new companies, you have the benefit of time and just experience. So I can't sit here and tell you what any particular business should do. I'm not a restaurant, for example, but the infrastructure even for restaurants has changed a lot in the last 5 years with apps and things of that nature, delivery services. The good thing is that with struggle comes opportunity, but you have to be willing to fill that space, because if you don't, someone else will.
Absolutely. It's almost like all companies now have to have someone or some people who are willing to take on that sort of making sure the business can adapt role. Maybe 100 years ago, your business could do one thing and it would probably not be displaced by anything else. Whilst now there's like things move, just feel, especially in relation to technology, which I'd love to get into with you a little bit. Things move quickly and change quickly. So you can have something either like a pandemic or something like a competitor or AI totally shift the playing field of that industry. And I think that's something that every business nowadays has to be able to adapt to some degree. And so what I would like to get your perspective on, because we've already started to touch on AI. And as I said, I did want to talk a little bit about technology. What do you think is the approach that businesses have to take or safeguard against themselves to some degree to be able to deal with the changing pace of the environment, technology, especially in reference to like AI as something that's changing everyone's situation?
No, it's a great question. It's a hard question, to be honest. I think the first thing I would say to that is don't forget the people. It's easy to sit here and think, oh, AI is at a point where I can replace X number of workers with these bots and they can do nearly the same amount of work or nearly the same quality of work as the people that I want to replace. The problem with that is if a company starts doing that on its own, it's probably not going to change the economy all that much. But if everyone starts doing this at scale at the same time, what you're doing is you're taking away the opportunity for people to buy your stuff. People need a paycheck. People need the ability to live and work and do all the things that they need to do. And what I would suggest is the idea that use AI as a partner, but not as a replacement, because you're kind of kneecapping yourself if you don't treat the workers well. And you kind of saw that earlier this week with an individual that was handled because they forgot that people matter.
Sorry, I don't know that example. Would you mind giving a little bit more on that?
Health insurance in the US is kind of a nightmare, generally speaking. And there was a CEO of a major insurance company that was found to be denying 1 out of every 3 cases. And he was murdered on a New York street earlier this week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this is not the conversation for that. I think mentioning it in this context is important just because when people feel cornered, when people feel threatened, they will act out, take away their jobs, take away their livelihoods. I mean, this is going back to why did Donald Trump get reelected? Why are we seeing authoritarian, regimes kind of taking foothold throughout the world? And it goes back to the idea of, I want to feel safe. I want to feel secure, even if these leaders are completely BSing you the whole time. So AI can kind of be the same sort of thing, right? They're not an authoritarian leader. They're not telling anyone what to do, but they are a threat. The better the leaders, CEOs, boards, just everyday managers can kind of use those tools to help augment their workforce and not replace their workforce, the better off all of us are going to be.
Well, and I can also see, just like you said, people have to have a paycheck in order to be able to buy your product. Measure it as you will, but people also have to have some sort of level of satisfaction and happiness in their current set of circumstances to operate as companies expect them to usually operate. Even if we try to figure this out, I know during the pandemic, like a lot of people were on unemployment here in the US. We can try to figure this out however we want, but like a lot of people were really unhappy and scared. And both of those things change spending as well as not having money. Hi there. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you mind leaving us a review, a like, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform? Thanks so much. That really helps our reach. The Founders Voyage podcast is now proudly sponsored by VidOps. Kane at VidOps has been taking care of our editing since early 2024. He works efficiently, and I'm sure you'll agree that he does a great job. Thank you to VidOps for helping bring this podcast to life. If you want the same great support we're getting for your podcast, or you need help with video, photography, or animation, you can get 10% off at vidops.io using our referral code Voyage. That's vidops.io, referral code Voyage. Now back to the show.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we can get into the conversations of what is the value of universal basic income and things like that. where people are offered a living stipend, if you will, not because they've done anything in particular, but just because people have a right to have some level of comfort, right? We can argue about what that level is, but you're starting with being fed, being housed, having healthcare, things like that. That's what UBI is often used for. It would be those types of purposes. And there's studies to actually bear out that if you give people free money, they're going to go towards necessities first. Yeah, I agree with what you said, Nance.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point though, because like you have a satisfaction in earning a paycheck, even if you're at a job that you don't want to be at. I actually want to just kind of spin off of what you were talking about with the healthcare system a little bit and make it a broader thing. I think the dark side of how we see politics and the economy intersect in the US is around lobbying. So, this again is going to be an opinion based question said by an optimist, but is there a way that businesses and government entities can coexist in like a morally grounded way that serves the people as a whole, but is still profitable for those entities? Like, is that possible? What would that look like?
Boy, that's a tough question because, yes, theoretically, absolutely, yes, it is possible. That was probably why I ran for office a couple years ago, right? Is if I didn't feel like it was possible to have government, business, and the community kind of working in harmony, what's the point of any of this, right? Making it less lucrative to be a public servant is kind of the beginning of change, right? And so this goes into insider trading, things like that, right? Like it's wild to me. And this is, and I'm going to speak about again, I'm going to kind of be US centric here. So bear with me on this. It's wild to me the number of people on both sides of the aisle, Republican or Democrat, who have made millions of dollars off insider trading while apparently serving, and I'm using air quotes as hardly as I possibly can here, while serving the communities that they were elected to serve. It's not just one group, it's both. And neither one of them to date has found a reason to make a change because they're all profiting off of it. That to me would be the first thing to actually kind of do this is get the decouple money and politics as much as possible. There's court decisions, Citizens United, for example, which is what allows someone like Elon Musk to pour $250 million into the last 3 months of Donald Trump's campaign. That is absolutely crazy. And you're paying to outdo 330 million other people that live in this country. Besides that, I mean, it decreases anyone's faith in the system, right? If money is what's going to buy power, why vote? If money and influence and lobbying is what's going to allow CalCare for all to pass or fail, for a little context on this, California had a bill out back in 2021, which was essentially a universal health care bill here for the state. It would have allowed all citizens of California to have reasonably priced healthcare. Some may call it free. It's not free. You'd pay a tax for it, but you'd have the ability to get relatively cheap healthcare. It was killed by the Democrats here, who are often seen as being champions for universal health care, because they got a $6 million donation from the insurance lobby. That happened, and they immediately killed it because why do the right thing? To me, money and greed kind of is the biggest poison pill here. And the key is electing good people. The key is actually being engaged. The key is actually doing your research, even though it's hard, even though information can be tainted and difficult to find in elections. Following the money is another thing that you can do, right? How does even a small campaign, who is the person funding that? And who are the people funding that? And what are they going to get out of it, right? You can start making some logical connections between these sorts of things and ultimately get to answers. And so the bigger question is obviously, how does this impact the economy, right? The more influence that business has on the economy, the less influence that the individuals have on the economy. And it makes you feel powerless.
I'll be honest, I believe a lot of other countries have done more than the US to decouple money and politics to a degree. Like I know lobbying is at least harder in the UK and Australia. I'm sure to some degree it still happens, but I think it's a problem, as you've said, of like motivation. Like all the people with the power to do the change to like decouple it are the people who are benefiting from money being so deeply ingrained in politics.
So while Brian was talking, I was really wondering how prevalent lobbying is in other countries. And it actually looks like it might be increasing in Europe, which is unfortunate. And it's definitely something that's prevalent in Canada. I was curious about that too. South Korea, lobbying is really not politically or socially acceptable either.
Yeah,
That's
and I'll be
interesting.
honest, I'm not necessarily opposed to all lobbying, right? I think that it's okay to advocate for your business. It's okay to advocate for an industry. But I think that in the US's case, the dynamic between how much influence a company has and how much influence a group of people has so off kilter at this point that there's no equivalence at all, right? I mean, again, this goes back to that situation with the CEO this week, right? This company has thousands of clients, probably hundreds of thousands of clients throughout the country. If every single one of them has not been touched by a denial already, every single one of them will at some point
Mhm.
if the company doesn't change course. And that group of citizens can get together and try to go present their case to the governmental leaders because they're never going to have the money that United Health Group is going to have. They don't get heard. Well, they get heard, but they don't get heard. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's where electing good people comes into play, because again, this is where the idea of this conversation was how does the economy and politics and the changes that are coming, how do they all intersect? And the
Mhm.
thing that I found just so fascinating about this murder of this man this week is in the US how universally it was almost cheered, which is wild. Social media is such an interesting vector for just kind of data collection, if you really want it to be. One of the things I've been watching all week, Health Group actually turned this off a couple of days ago, which I think is hilarious. Anyways, United Health. We'll just say that because there's a United Health Group and there's a United Healthcare, and I don't want to misspeak on which one it is. If you look online, you'll figure out quickly which one it is. But the point is, the company put out a statement shortly after their CEO was killed, basically saying, we feel really bad about this. Condolences to his family, condolences to all of us here that work at this company. He was a great man, blah, blah, blah. And the Facebook post alone had something in the neighborhood of like 85,000 reactions, and 80,000 of those were people laughing.
Wow.
That is unheard of. There's just it's not like in the United States right now, you can't get two people to look at a picture of a thumbtack and agree that it's a thumbtack right now. But I don't want to say everyone, because I mean, clearly 5%, 7%, whatever that number is, felt differently about it. But that united people beyond politics, beyond income, beyond any of the things that typically divide. And I think there's something there, right? Like it is this festering anger, this festering just sense of hopelessness that needs to change. It just has to change, but people have to also take responsibility for their piece of the puzzle in this. And
Mhm.
ignoring elections and not engaging in the politics process is extraordinarily dangerous, and it leads to bad outcomes.
You're absolutely right. Like there is, I think, and this is something that I've been thinking about a huge amount the last few years, there is a underlying anger in younger people right now. And I think it's something that's festering there. And I think it's something that's in various ways coming out in negative ways.
Yeah. And I think that the thing that makes me interested in this one in particular, you're right. Younger people, this has been going on for quite some time, right? Whether it be the education system here in the US being broken, whether it be housing being completely unaffordable. There's a number of issues. I mean, groceries being completely unaffordable. There's a number of issues here that disproportionately impact the young because they're just getting started. They're just trying to get on their feet. And it is incredibly difficult to get on your feet under good circumstances. But for our parents, we're all kind of around the same age, Spencer, Nancy, myself. our parents, when they had the opportunity to buy a house, often it was probably in the 70s or 80s, and you're buying a house for $15,000, $20,000, or 15, 20,000 pounds, right? It's not cheap, especially back in the day, but at the same time, it's very reasonable. Right. For the same person today to buy a house, I think the mean price in the US is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 400,000. And then wages have not kept up with that at all. So you've got this twofold problem. All the things that you require for even a remotely decent quality of life have all gone up exponentially price wise, but your wages have mostly stayed flat. In my own case, the company that I work for, I like my company. I'm not at all trying to dump on them. I've stayed here for almost a decade at this point. So, I mean, there's got to be something there. But the reality of it is that I have been getting 1.5% raises kind of at max over the past few years while inflation's up 3, 4, 5, 6%. So every year I work for this company, I'm being paid less to do the same amount of work or more work with more responsibility. So that is a challenging situation. And I'm fortunate, right? Like my job pays enough to keep us going. I always have the ability to make a change at any time. There is some reality there, but at the same time, I don't know that anyone should argue that it's okay to continually get paid less to do the same or more.
Sure. I mean, morally, for sure. And then also, it doesn't lead to a healthy economy, right?
Yeah, it goes back to that same thing we were talking about earlier, right? Like the more of these types of things that happen, the less things that people can buy. Everyone falters because of it.
hmm And this isn't a perfect transition, but it does kind of speak to the importance of, I think, this topic a little bit. There's been so much talk about, with Trump taking office, the tariffs that he's proposed and how that will affect business. Well, actually, I think how it will affect business is not talked about enough. I think what is fascinating is how in the US, I've seen some people seemingly nostalgic for tariffs to come back, and others seem quite fearful. Brian, do you want to delve into that a little bit? And then we may have some more questions and discussion points to bring up in there.
Yeah, so again, this is the US centric thing. Tariffs, just in general, are the idea behind them is it is a tax that's imposed on goods that are imported. That tax is passed along to the consumer. The businesses do not pay it. It's something that is added to the final cost of a good or service. Well, not a service in this case, it'd be a good. How does a tariff affect the way we do business with others? So with a tariff, let's say the tariff's 20%, the average US citizen is going to then be paying 20% more for whatever that good is. And this adds up over time. The US imports a lot of stuff. And so any of these countries that we are importing from that do this, it's going to increase the price of that by say 20%, right? So as that happens, your ability to spend money elsewhere is decreased. And so for countries that we're not necessarily having tariffs with, it's going to affect the demand for goods from your countries. Because if we're paying for fruits and vegetables from China and different fruits and vegetables are being sold from Guatemala and we're tariffing China, you may see some increase in purchases from Guatemala. But if they're not the same things and the palates of the United States citizens doesn't change to adapt with it, you may actually see less of your stuff getting purchased because they see the stuff from China as more of a necessity. So it's convoluted and it's challenging because you can't necessarily predict exactly how buying patterns change with tariffs. But what you can say undoubtedly is that if buying patterns don't change, there's less money to go around. And the only people that benefit from this are not the people that are just trying to get by. We'll put it that way. Does that answer that question for you?
Yeah, I think so. I do think it's interesting how some people are nostalgic about like tariffs coming back, though. I think that also speaks to how the next president that we do, he perhaps reminded people of some things that they are nostalgic for, whether or not they will actually benefit us.
Yeah, and I have my opinions on these people, and you and I have talked about them before, and I'll try to be nicer about it than I typically am. These people are undereducated, don't put a ton of thought into how this is actually going to affect them. They're affected by emotion more than rationality. To give Trump credit for something, he's very good at playing on people's emotions. Whether you love him, whether you hate him, he knows how to push buttons and get a particular outcome out of it. I'm sure that any of you guys that know me know how I feel about Donald Trump, but there's a reason I ran for office a few years ago. I'll just say this. I think that whole MAGA movement's a cancer on society. But how does it ultimately impact the economy is it's going to be hard to say. There's a part of me that's hopeful that the faction of the US and the faction of the global world, because there's different variants of this all over the place. It's not just a US thing. As they see that this desire for something from the past, whether it ever happened or not, isn't going to come to fruition in the way that they think it's going to, I'd like to think that eventually some of them see the light and change can happen, like real actual change, not this nostalgia for some bullshit that never existed in the first place. It's going to take time. You start getting into the psychology of cult behavior. That is something that I don't know what it's going to take to move these people forward. A lot of these guys are already struggling, and that's what drew them in the first place, right? And so, okay, if we're struggling a little bit more, are we doing this for the cause, right? Or are we really being duped? And that's the question that each of those people is eventually going to have to wrestle with. And what the outcome of that is, I cannot begin to tell you, but honestly, I just see more pain coming, at least for the interim.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having been here in the UK during Brexit, I think there's actually an echo of a similar mentality where Brexit, a lot of the perception from people who voted to leave was like, it will return us to a time that was better for the UK. And now I think a lot of those people are having to sort of understand that whether or not that history time ever happened, it's certainly not coming back, and certainly not from Brexit. And I feel like 3-4 years down the road, it'll be a similar experience in the US in some ways. Obviously, we'll see.
Yeah, that's honestly a great point. I'd love to just have you get a little bit more in depth on that. Like, how has Britain kind of wrestled with the post-Brexit economy and the impact that had? Because from my perspective, I could sit here and tell you I saw pain coming the second that happened, the second it was ever announced, right? It was never going to go well from my point of view. But again, I don't live it. I don't know it. How do you see it?
Well, at the time, like when the back and forth about it was happening, you could get into maybe a taxi or talk to someone randomly and it would come up as a topic and they would have different perspectives to what I had. They seemed to believe that there was like a really positive economic change coming from it. And it seems like obviously there's been other factors, so it's hard to say for sure, but like the cost of living crisis is a big thing here because a lot of people are unable to afford the warmth during winter. Groceries prices have all gone up. Like everything you need to sort of survive is more expensive now. Electricity has now, obviously the Ukraine war apparently had a big factor in this as well. I'm not trying to say it was just Brexit, but my understanding is Brexit was also a big factor in this. Electricity's gone up, I think 3 times, is 3 times more expensive than it was a few years ago. It's just like everything is more expensive. And for me and Jess, we're totally fine. We make enough money to be safe and happy and everything. But even we have felt at times like it can be a little bit more difficult than it was previously. And I'll talk to people now who are saying like they genuinely believe living in London right now, you have to be making at least £100,000 a year, which is a very large percentage of money for a lot of people. The percentage of people who are on that amount of money is very small. So yeah, definitely felt it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And like I said, I mean, I can see it from abroad, kind of like you similarly see Trump here, right? You can kind of see some of the train wreck aspects coming, but to see how it actually impacts day to day is challenging unless you're actually living it. And fortunately for you guys, you're doing all right. Fortunately for us, we're doing all right. But I would greatly prefer not just me doing all right, but like society. like that's kind of the end goal here is like, let's make this place better for everyone and not just for a select few.
Absolutely. Now, we have already hit the hour. I do apologize for that. I was hoping if you have a bit more time, we could get some, from your perspective, key takeaways for like businesses, entrepreneurs in the next few years.
Yeah, I think sure, and I'm not going anywhere. I think everyone here knows that I'm tied to the other co-host of this. So my key takeaways, I think, just engagement is honestly the biggest thing I can tell you. Be engaged in your community, be engaged in the politics of it all, even if it seems dry or difficult or not applicable. In some cases, it may be applicable to you someday. None of us thought we were going to have a pandemic 5 years ago, and we had a major pandemic that has changed the way that all of us live. It's just a matter of time before the next crisis comes, and it's not going to look like a novel virus. It's going to be something entirely different, but it's going to impact all of us. I think as small businesses, the best thing you can do is be as thoughtful as you can about how you develop your business within the constraints that you have, right? Money's always going to be an issue. Time is always going to be an issue, but try to think through what happens if, as best you can. If you can't build out a full plan towards those things, certainly at least having the idea of a plan is better than nothing. And for all of us, I think it does just come down to do the best you can to look out for each other and try to call out problems where you see them, because that's how we move forward from this, is not just sitting there and taking it, not just sitting there and saying, oh, it'll get better when, or not just getting nostalgic for something that never was, but being clear-eyed about the difficulties that we face and the fact that the only way we get through them is together. That's kind of my thought on the economy, politics, and making it all work, is we have to do it together.
That's a great way to wrap up. I really appreciate it. And when you're talking about being engaged, I was thinking about the making small talk part of Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. And if you haven't read that, I highly recommend giving it a read. It gives examples from world economics and politics and social change, more importantly. And it's not that long. But thank you so much, Brian, for joining us as kind of our subject matter expert. You're not an economist, but I really do appreciate you putting some time and energy into researching this and talking about it with us. And I feel like I learned more about Brexit, and we're going to have to continue this with someone else talking about things from their view, from their corner of the world too. So I look forward to that. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us today. As always, we appreciate you bringing your perspectives and energy to these discussions. Spencer and I feel really fortunate to be part of this community with you and for the opportunity to bring you cooperative learning experiences each week. And we love to hear your nominations for future interview guests and future topical discussions. In the meantime, please feel free to check out the edited podcast episodes on the foundersvoyage.org website or by looking up Founders Voyage on your favorite podcast platform.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great morning, afternoon, day in general.
Thanks, guys.
You've just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.